Hi everyone, it's Mrs. W again with part 3 of Who Was Walt Disney. When we left off the last time, Mickey was becoming more and more popular. Let's continue on with Walt's life. Walt Disney was on top of the world when trouble hit the studio again. A dishonest distributor wanted control of Mickey Mouse. Walt had lost Oswald. He was not going to let Mickey get away. So Roy worked out a deal so that the Disneys kept ownership of Mickey. In the early 1930s, Walt Disney Studios produced many short cartoons called Silly Symphonies. As always, Walt wanted to do something new. Three Little Pigs had much more of a plot. The story of the pigs and the hungry wolf came from the Green Fairy book by Andrew Lang. It was Walt's idea to put in a song. It was called Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf? People came out of theaters whistling the peppy tune. The song seemed to cheer people up. Three Little Pigs came out in 1933. Many people needed cheering up. It was a time of the Great Depression. Thousands of companies had gone out of business. Millions of workers lost their jobs. People lost their homes. Fewer families had money to spend on extras like going to the movie theaters. But the Walt Disney Studios was doing fine. By 1930, a company called Technicolor was producing good color films for movies. Walt is said to have shouted, "At last we can show a rainbow on the screen." Walt's Flowers and Trees, about two trees who fall in love, was the first cartoon in full color. It won an Academy Award. Everyone at Disney worked long hours, but nobody worked harder than Walt. He drove himself to the point of collapse. In the fall of 1931, Walt and Lillian took a train all across the country to Washington, D.C. Being on a train was always relaxing and fun for Walt. They took a boat trip through the Panama Canal. He and Lillian lounged on deck chairs and had romantic dinners. When the Disneys returned home, Walt took up sports to ease his stress: ice skating, swimming, horseback riding, and polo. In 1933, Lillian became pregnant. Walt was thrilled. He wrote his family about all of the pink and blue baby items in the nursery. On December 18th, a healthy baby girl was born, Diane Marie Disney. Lillian could not have any more children after Diane, so in 1937, the Disneys adopted a baby girl and named her Sharon May. Walt did everything he could to give his daughters a happy home life, and he always had a movie camera in his hand to record family fun. He read to his girls, took them on outings, acted out stories for them, and took them bike riding at the studio. He even built a giant playhouse for them that looked like it was made for Snow White. As for fancy Hollywood parties, Walt had no interest in them. He liked staying home, eating chili and beans on crackers. Roy and his wife and their daughter lived nearby. The two families saw a lot of each other. Walt's parents, however, were still living far away in Portland, Oregon. So Walt and Roy decided to buy a house in California for them. The Disneys could all get together for backyard barbecues. The house was a wonderful gift meant to bring joy. Instead, it brought terrible sorrow. There was something wrong with the heating system. Suddenly one day in 1938, Elias and Flora became sick from breathing in poisonous gas that was leaking. Elias recovered, but sadly Flora died. Walt was so upset for the rest of his life that he refused to talk about his mother's death. Walt was always looking for the next big idea. He was always pushing the boundaries of what could be done in a cartoon. He and his artists perfected sound and color. Walt didn't stop there. In 1933, he decided to make a full-length animated film. Up until then, cartoons were short. They lasted only a few minutes. In theaters, they were shown before a full-length movie. Yet Walt knew that kids would sit watching hours of different Mickey Mouse cartoons. So why wouldn't they sit through one long animated movie if it was good enough? Besides being short, cartoons were always full of slapstick gags. A full-length animated movie, however, needed more than humor. Walt had to have a story with romance and drama and excitement. The famous fairy tale, Snow White, had all that. It was the story Walt picked. It took years to create Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. More than 250,000 drawings were done for the 83-minute movie. Walt was in charge of every step of production. At meetings, he acted out scenes for his animation team. The artists copied Walt's expressions and movements into their drawings. He wanted each character to seem as real as a live actor. Yes, there would be funny scenes, but there would also be parts where people would cry or hold their breath in fear. The backgrounds were important too. They could not look flat and two-dimensional. For example, the house of the Seven Dwarfs had to look as if it were solid and in real space. A special multi-plane camera also helped make everything look three-dimensional. Disney artists spent more than 3 years making Snow White. One artist spent almost a year drawing a funny scene of the dwarfs eating soup, and it didn't even end up in the movie. Roy had one of the hardest jobs. He had to come up with the money to make Snow White. The studio borrowed more than $1.5 million. This was an incredible sum of money for a cartoon. And what if the film flopped? How would the studio pay it back? Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs opened on December 21st, 1937 at the Carthay Circle Theater in Los Angeles. Famous Hollywood stars came dressed in evening gowns and tuxedos. The audience gasped at the beauty of the film, and at the end, the applause was like thunder. Time magazine put Walt on the cover and called Snow White a masterpiece. Walt won a special Academy Award. It had a golden Oscar surrounded by 7 smaller ones. Over the next few years, Disney produced 3 more wonderful movies in animation: Fantasia, Pinocchio, and Bambi. However, none matched the film magic of Snow White. To this day, it remains one of the most popular movies ever made. Snow White made so much money that Roy and Walt bought 51 acres of land for a new studio in Burbank, California. In 1940, everyone moved into the complex. The company was now a big business. There were hundreds of employees. The animators worked in one building, the inkers and painters and special effects artists worked in others. Walt thought that his employees would be happy to leave their old cramped spaces and work in a modern air-conditioned building. But he was wrong. In the old days, all the Disney employees worked closely together and felt like family. Now they were separated from each other. People rarely saw Walt, and there were complaints that the studio felt like a big factory. On top of that, once again, the studio was having money trouble. A lot of the money came from selling Disney cartoons to theaters in countries all over Europe. But since 1939, World War II, had been raging in Europe. On May 1941, hundreds of Disney workers went on strike. That meant they refused to work until their demands were met. The strike lasted 9 weeks. It upset Walt terribly. Everything changed at the studio after December 7th, 1941. That's when the Japanese Army bombed an American naval base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Now the United States was in the war too. American soldiers were fighting on 2 fronts, in the Pacific and in Europe. The U.S. Army took over Walt's studio. Training films for studios were needed. Walt had a hard time feeling creative doing this kind of work. The war ended in 1945. Now Walt could go back to making his own movies. Several live-action adventure movies came out, but audience didn't like Treasure Island, Swiss Family Robinson, or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea as much as they had liked Snow White. Walt turned to making nature movies like Sea Island, stories that filmed real animals but had a made-up story. Walt did not pour his heart into these films the way he had with his classics. Maybe making movies was starting to bore him a little, or maybe it was because Walt was already thinking about the next big thing. In some ways, Walt Disney remained a kid at heart. When he took his daughters to the merry-go-round in Griffith Park, he'd get on a horse and ride too. At home, Walt spent hours tinkering with wind-up toys and model trains. He even had a real little railroad built in his backyard. On weekends, Walt put on an engineer's cap. He'd take his daughters and friends for a ride. Afterward, he'd whip up a goopy banana split that nobody could finish. It was good, wholesome fun. That started Walt thinking, what if there were a place where families, not just kids, could go and have fun together? It would be like an amusement park, only cleaner, different, better. It would have a village like Marceline, Missouri. Stores would sell Disney clothes and toys. There'd be a little railroad, a movie theater, and rides, lots of rides. Roy wasn't wild about the Disneyland idea. Who will pay for it, he asked, but Walt already had the answer. Television always fascinated Walt. He saw that it was the next big thing. All through the 1920s and 30s, people tuned into popular radio shows. But you could only listen to the radio. You couldn't see anything. Television brought about the end of radio shows. Many filmmakers also thought of TV as the enemy. The little screen was taking away the audience for big screen pictures. Not Walt. He saw TV as another way to entertain people. He thought that in return for a Disney TV show, a network would invest in his theme park. Walt was right. ABC started running a show that featured Disney cartoons and some live-action skits. It was a big hit. The only show that was more popular was I Love Lucy, starring the comedian Lucille Ball. Walt was the host of the show. He talked to viewers in a friendly, grandfatherly way. Before long, kids all knew Walt Disney's face. He was a star. The Mickey Mouse Club was another hit for ABC. In every episode, there was always a newsreel, a cartoon, and songs and dances performed by a group of young actors called Mouseketeers. The first show aired in 1955. For many years, it ran 5 days a week. He also created a Western miniseries called Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett was a real-life frontiersman from Tennessee who lived in the early 1800s. To play Davy, Walt chose a good-looking actor named Fess Parker. There were only 3 episodes of Davy Crockett, but every kid wanted a coonskin cap like Davy's. Every kid knew the words to the theme song. The studio made a lot of money in television. Television helped Walt build his Disneyland dream. As with all of the other big Disney projects, Walt was in control. He loved working on the theme park. If he wanted to create a jungle, he did. If a lake wasn't big enough, he had made it bigger. Disneyland opened on July 17, 1955 in Anaheim, California. Just 4 days earlier, he and Lillian had their 30th wedding anniversary. Opening day did not go smoothly. Crowds stood in a line in 100-degree heat. Some of the rides weren't working. The train didn't lead anywhere. It came to a dead end. There were not enough trash cans or water fountains. But Walt had things fixed right away. Soon the place was spotless. Everyone who worked there was polite and cheerful. They had to go to Disney University to learn exactly how to behave toward visitors. People all over the world were flocking to Disneyland. They could spend time in Fantasyland with its fairy tale castle and fairy tale characters in costume. They could look for hippos and other wild animals in Adventureland, or ride on the Mark Twain riverboat. There was Main Street that looked very much like the one in Marceline, Missouri. Walt enjoyed Disneyland as much as anyone, but he had to disguise himself in a floppy hat and sunglasses, or else fans would mob him. Sometimes a child would still recognize him. Walt put his finger to his lips and secretly slipped the child an autograph. After hours, Walt had Disneyland all to himself. He drove a mini fire engine through the streets or relaxed in his private apartment over the firehouse on Main Street. Already he was thinking about the next big thing, a city of the future. Walt's plan for Epcot, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow, included monorails and underground roads to help keep children safe from cars. City streets would be designed to look like different places from around the world. It would be just the kind of place Walt would want to live in himself. Some men slow down as they age, but not Walt Disney. He had too many ideas to quit working. In 1964, a giant World's Fair was held outside New York City. Some of the best exhibits were designed by Walt Disney. One was called Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. An Abraham Lincoln robot got up from a chair. He looked left and right at his audience, and he shifted his weight from one foot to another and recited a speech about liberty. The robot looked so real that people thought it was an actor. Walt didn't spend much time in the studios anymore. Making movies didn't interest him. Diane and Sharon were both married. Walt and Lillian became regular babysitters for their grandchildren. Walt loved having a house full of little children again. He often sat on his lawn and watched his wild bunch pile up patio furniture to make backyard forts and rocket ships. He let the kids spend the night at Disneyland and explore it when nobody else was around. And he put some of them into Disney films just for fun. In July 1966, Walt and Lillian celebrated their 41st anniversary. They took the whole family on a cruise to British Columbia. Walt wasn't feeling well, but he enjoyed being with his grandchildren. He let them crawl all over him. When he got tired, he climbed to the upper deck to think. He'd think about Epcot. After the trip, Walt didn't get better. Medical tests discovered something very serious. Walt had lung cancer. Walt had smoked cigarettes since his days in France. Until 1964, however, people did not know that smoking caused cancer. While Walt was in the hospital, Roy came for a visit. He found Walt staring at the ceiling. Walt pointed out where everything was going to go at Epcot. The next day, December 15, 1966, he died. Walt Disney was 65 years old. He did not live to see the opening of Walt Disney World in Florida in 1971, but Roy was there. He waited to retire until Walt Disney World was completed. Walt Disney has been gone for a long time. However, he is still entertaining people through Disney books, records, movies, toys, and his parks all over the world, where each year millions of families come with one idea: to have fun. And that is the end of our story of Who was Walt Disney. We'll see you next time.